The ions formed when electrolytes dissolve or dissociate serve four major functions in the body. Because they're usually confined to a particular body compartment and they're more numerous than non-electrolytes, certain ions control the osmosis of water between fluid compartments. Remember, water moves following electrolytes. Ions also help to maintain the acid-base balance that we have to have for normal cellular activities. They can carry electrical current, which allows the production of action potentials and graded potentials. And several ions will serve as cofactors that we have to have for enzymes to have their proper and full activity. This image shows the concentration of the main electrolytes and protein anions in blood, plasma, interstitial fluid, and intracellular fluid. The big difference between the two extracellular fluids, the plasma and the interstitial fluid, is that blood plasma has many protein anions in contrast to the interstitial fluid, which really doesn't have that many. Because normal capillary membranes are pretty much impermeable to proteins, only a few plasma proteins leak out of the blood vessels and into the interstitial fluid. So this difference in protein concentration is responsible for the blood osmotic pressure that's exerted by the blood plasma. The electrolyte content of intracellular fluid differs a lot from the extracellular fluid. In the extracellular fluid, the most abundant cation, remember that's a positively charged ion, is sodium, and the most abundant anion, negatively charged, is chloride. In the intracellular fluid, the most abundant cation is potassium, and the most abundant anions are proteins and phosphates. Now we're going to look at some of these most important electrolytes on the upcoming slides. We'll begin with sodium because, as I mentioned, they're the most abundant ion in the extracellular fluid. So sodium plays a very important role in fluid and electrolyte balance. The flow of sodium through voltage-gated channels in the cell membranes is also responsible for generating and conducting action potentials in neurons and muscle fibers. You didn't think you could forget about all that, right? I know, it was Anatomy 1. Typical daily intake of sodium in most Americans is far greater than what our body requires because of our diet. So the kidneys are able to excrete excess sodium, but they can also conserve it when we don't have enough. Sodium level in the blood is controlled by aldosterone, ADH, and ANP. Wow, those hormones keep coming back, right? So just to summarize again, aldosterone increases the renal reabsorption of sodium. When the blood plasma concentration of sodium drops, a condition known as hyponatremia, ADH release also stops so that we make sure that we are retaining the proper amount of fluids. The lack of ADH permits greater excretion of water in the urine and restores the normal sodium balance back into the extracellular fluid. The ANP increases sodium excretion by the kidneys when sodium level is above normal. So that's a condition called hypernatremia. So the ADH and the ANP, along with the aldosterone, help us to maintain proper sodium value. But if sodium ions remain in excess in body fluids because the kidneys fail to excrete enough, water is also going to be retained as well, osmosis. The result is increased blood volume, increased blood pressure, and edema, which is an abnormal accumulation of interstitial fluid. Renal failure and hyperaldosteronism, which means there's too much aldosterone being released, are the two main causes of sodium retention. Excessive urinary loss of sodium, on the other hand, causes excess water loss and results in hypovolemia, or low blood volume. Hypovolemia related to sodium loss is usually due to inadequate secretion of aldosterone, which can be associated with adrenal insufficiency or too vigorous therapy using antidiuretic drugs. Chloride ions are the most prevalent anion in the extracellular fluid, and it moves relatively easy between the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid because most plasma membranes contain chloride leak channels. So chloride helps to balance the level of anions in different fluid compartments. And the chloride ions also, this should sound familiar to you, chloride, hydrochloric acid. So these chloride ions help to make up the gastric juices. Potassium ions are the most abundant cations in the intracellular fluid, and they play a role in establishing the resting membrane potential and repolarizing after inaction potential in neurons and muscle fibers. Potassium also helps maintain normal intracellular fluid volume. When potassium moves into or out of cells, it's very often going to be exchanged for hydrogen ions, both positively charged, right? And that helps to regulate the pH of body fluids. Normal blood plasma concentration is controlled by aldosterone. When blood plasma is high, more aldosterone is secreted into the blood. Aldosterone stimulates the cells of the renal collecting ducts to secrete more potassium, so potassium is lost in the urine. When blood plasma level is low, aldosterone secretion decreases and less potassium is lost in the urine. Because potassium is needed during repolarization after an action potential, abnormal potassium levels can be deadly. For instance, hyperkalemia, too much potassium, can cause death due to ventricular fibrillation. I don't know why that term is always difficult for me to say. Bicarb ions are the second most prevalent extracellular anion. When the concentration of bicarbonate ions increases as blood flows through the systemic capillaries because of CO2 released from our metabolic activities, remember, the CO2 combines with water to form carbonic acid. When carbonic acid dissociates, it releases hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The kidneys are the main regulators of blood bicarb concentration. The cells of the renal tubule can either form bicarb and release it into the blood when blood levels are low, or excrete excess bicarbonate in the urine when the levels are too high, and therefore help to regulate blood pH. Because of the large amount of calcium stored in the bone, calcium is the most abundant mineral in the body. About 98% of the calcium in adults is located in the bones and in the teeth, where it combines with phosphates to form a crystal-like structure, calcium phosphate. In body fluids, calcium is mainly an extracellular cation, and it plays an important role in blood clotting, neurotransmitter release, maintenance of muscle tone, and in the excitability of neurons and muscle cells. The most important regulator of calcium concentration in the blood is parathyroid hormone. When blood levels of calcium are low, parathyroid hormone is going to be released, and that stimulates osteoclast in bone tissue to break down calcium phosphate and release that calcium into the blood. Parathyroid hormone also increases the reabsorption of calcium from the glomerular filtrate as it passes through the renal tubules, and we get that calcium back into the blood. It increases the production of calcitriol. Remember, that was the active form of vitamin D, and that in turn increases the calcium absorption from the food as it passes through the gastrointestinal tract. Calcitonin, on the other hand, is going to accelerate the deposition of calcium into the bone, so it lowers blood calcium. Again, there's that endocrine system. About 95% of phosphate in adults is present as calcium phosphate, like we just talked about, in the bone and the teeth. The phosphates are an important intracellular anion, and they also serve as an important buffer of hydrogen ions in the body fluid and the urine. Magnesium is the second most common intracellular cation, and it serves as a cofactor for certain enzymes that's needed for the metabolism of carbohydrates and proteins, and it's also needed for sodium-potassium pumps. Magnesium, for normal neuromuscular activity, plays a role as a cofactor, also in significant synaptic transmission and myocardial functioning.